Salam alaikum.
Salam, dear ones.
Let's bring our attention to our breath. And begin to enter more consciously into our inner life. Allow your center of gravity to move to your heart. The heart, which is your true intelligence. The heart which the intellect should serve and the body should serve. The heart that knows our true situation in this universe. The heart which knows relationship. So with every out-breath, emptying, clearing, being washed. And with every in-breath, awakening from our deeper self. From a witnessing consciousness that precedes even our thoughts, emotions, reactions. From a part of ourselves which is still and silent. The breath can take us there and sustain us in that state. And you might add to the breath a divine name that you choose. Receiving the power and the energy of that divine name on the inhalation and radiating it on the exhalation. It could be Nur, the infinite light. It could be Rahman, the infinite compassion. It could be Hu, divine presence. It could be Alim, knowingness, the all-knowing. It could be Hai, the ever-living. So choose for yourself. So we have this gift of silence together around the globe in a shared moment. And now we might join our voices in this simple sound of Hu, the pronoun of divine presence. Bismillah. Hu. Hu. Now continue in silence. Amen. 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 So it's Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day.
Thank you.
And to all the fathers on the call and generations back, and inshallah for those to come.
Amen. Amen. Today I wanted to talk about the distinction between the esoteric path and exoteric life. It's important to understand this distinction, and it explains why we do things the way we do and what it is we're doing. One is the work of inner being, and the other is about our superficial life, including much of religion, politics, and worldly ambitions. You know, in the Gospels, Jesus rails against the scribes and the Pharisees, the people of dogmatic religion who are concerned primarily with outer appearances, rituals, formalities, adherence to particular beliefs. And in every spiritual tradition, there is an inner path. And that inner path has the purpose of awakening our inner being, our essential self. So the differences between the esoteric and the exoteric. Well, one, it has a lot to do with being in a state of sleep. And another is about awakening. One is about trying to meet the ego's expectations. And the other is teaching us to observe the ego and teaching the ego itself to serve. One is about desiring attention, and the other is about becoming attention. So that brings us back to the theme of this month. And behind this theme is many layers of understanding and teaching. So we recognize that from childhood, every human being has a certain need for attention. And if we're deprived of it, we'll develop strategies to gain it or even steal it. And as we mature, it could be that careers and whole areas of human activity are built upon this need to gain the attention of others. In our unconscious condition, in our state of sleep, we're also set up to gain the approval of others and to avoid disapproval. And given that society and even the family structure sometimes exists on a foundation of false and superficial values, this desire to gain the approval of others unconsciously leads us further and further away from our inner being, from our essential self, and in the end may even lead us to a state of hypocrisy. On the esoteric path, however, we learn to observe ourselves, our reactions, our needs for approval, our needs for attention, our need to be right, and all the things that the false self is built upon. From time to time, we refer to the Melami path in Sufism, sometimes called the path of blame. And the Melami path is a beautiful example of a kind of warriorship with these false values. Our need for approval, our dependence on superficial values, on appearing or trying to appear better than we are. So the Melami path, the path of blame, which is the path of a deep and pure spirituality, is a confrontation with everything that's false in ourselves, with our hypocrisy. It's a lessening also of the grip of our judgments and opinions of others. So to rigorously observe what we're doing to gain attention and approval requires that we awaken an observer that is free from all these needs. Hopefully that's where we've just been. That's the state we've just emerged from, or hopefully not emerged from, but continue to be in. The state of sleep, or in Sufism the term is ghaflat, heedlessness, is when we live, it has certain qualities, certain features that can be identified. And one of these is that we have an expectation that there should be no resistance to our search for pleasure and no disturbance of our ego's expectations and no lack of approval from others. And should we meet suffering, disturbance, the judgment of others, our immediate reaction is to either blame something outside ourselves or to blame ourselves, rather than simply observing as an objective and compassionate witness. If the goal of our spiritual journey has been described as coming close to God, becoming intimate with the divine, it's clear that when we're in this unconscious state of sleep, when we're under this tyranny of the false self and all the ego's expectations, the blaming and looking for something to blame, we're far from intimacy with God. Again, the inner path is about awakening our inner being, the essential self, that self that is free from the expectation of being always undisturbed, approved of by others, the receiver of unvarying admiration from the world around us. But in awakening to an inner being that relies instead on inner conscience and sincerity. If we could become attention itself, we would be more disconnected from the mechanism of egoism that distorts everything. We would be freed from these unrealistic expectations of constant pleasure, approval, and non-disturbance. And if we could become attention itself, the soul, the inner being, the essential self, we'd be more awake. And this essential self is spontaneously and naturally more in harmony with divine guidance and intelligence. There's an intimate relationship between who we are at the root of our being and that infinite intelligence, that infinite knowing, and also that infinite compassion and love is more immediately available from that root of the self. And so on the spiritual path, you will not be preached to. You'll be encouraged to, we will be encouraged to observe ourselves in a non-reactive way and to study our reactions, judgments, and opinions. To not give them so much importance. And to rely instead on that deeper self that's not enslaved by the false values of the world, the unconscious needs for attention and approval, but a self that exists under the auspices of divine mercy and compassion. So there are times when we dive right into that divine reality and all its beauty and ecstasy, and sometimes through the words of Mevlana or the sayings of the prophet or the verses of Revelation. And then there are times when we remind ourselves that there's a very practical psychological work to do, and it's based on an understanding of a spiritual psychology that helps us to see what the mechanism of sleep is, to observe it, and to understand the role of judgment and blame in our lives, the effect that this has on ourselves. And these other, shall we say, tendencies of the false self to, in a very unrealistic way, to think we'll go through life without disturbance. And then there's a subtle trap within spirituality or on the spiritual path itself. Again, the idea that somehow our spirituality will be an insulation from suffering, from disappointment, from grief. But deeper in our experience is this inner essential being, which is in fact spontaneously, reliably, mercifully the recipient of divine grace and intelligence and guidance. And it's that we're doing what we can to remain close to and live our lives from. So this is a bit of background on the theme we've been working with. Beyond desiring attention, become attention. You know, in the Quran, this is beautifully expressed when Prophet Muhammad came to the divine proximity, and it said of him, and his eye did not swerve. His eye was not distracted, nor did it swerve. Telling us that Prophet Muhammad had this capacity to remain in this single-pointed attentiveness. So that's our work. And Camille has something to share with us. We don't usually consult in advance. we gamble.
We see what God brings.
We gamble to see what she's come up with. And so it's always beautiful. And inspiring.
Inshallah, this a moment with Hazrati Shams. He seemed to be wanting to visit this morning. And resonances. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He says, beware of what you're afraid of. The self, the nafs, must pass through the stage of the broken heart. In another moment, he reminds us that God says to us, I am with those whose hearts have been broken on my way. In this moment, Sham says, even if that Brokenness doesn't consume it, it passes through suffering. But how can one know? One has to obtain it through knowledge, agreement, the consent, and mutual understanding. That's enough now. You've clarified it, you've seen it openly. Sometimes Shams is a bit cryptic in his words. And in another moment, he reminds us that metaphor is a bridge to the truth. And truth bridges into metaphor. And he tells us to keep the dervish's words in your mind, even though he doesn't explain them to you. On the way of God, he freely gives his heart and his possessions, because the world is only a bridge. But while the bridge is falling down and on fire, one who makes buildings on such a bridge can never be safe. So in this moment, he says, if you want to understand the meaning in the words of the great prophet who says, the learned are the inheritors of the prophets, the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. I won't explain anything about him. You have seen the pleasure of worship. It's as if you are finding your own worth. If you hadn't seen or grasped it, you might have dived and gone into the divine universe. May you seek higher and higher. May you say, Allahu Akbar. God is greater than all else. Worship consists in this. See to ridding yourself of the thoughts and groundless fears that come into your imagination, and turn your eye to higher universes, because she is more exalted than anything that comes to the mind and its imaginings. Even the idea and imagination of the prophets and heavenly messengers, he cannot even be contained within those. He's even greater. Sometimes they say, everything is the truth, Haq. There is no creation, Hulk. But if there were no creation, speech would have no letters or voices. There are no letters or voices where the truth is. And then Hazrati Shams reminds us there is one source of water. Though it may have separated into many streams, rivers, and canals, sometimes it flows one way and sometimes it flows another. A time comes when the water that flows along this way empties out the other way until it passes into its own channel. Sometimes the water that comes from that channel flows in this direction. Those who pass through the various waterways to the source of the water, drink from it, dive into it, and get wet. From then on, they've been liberated from the branches and reached the root of their source. Likewise, those who catch hold of a branch of a tree will break it and fall. But those who take hold of the trunk of the tree will then gain all the branches. They are content with the abode of the beloved. Ooh.
Ooh. Amen. And thank you, Shams.
Subhanallah ya Rabbil Alameen.
Yeah. Such a pure message. So what Shams is referring to as worship is that state of drawing near to our inmost self and being conscious at that level. And the ceremonies of worship, the formalities of worship can be a bridge to that reality. Otherwise, why do them? What use are they? But the essential worship is to be face to face with that truth, with that beloved. So, yes. Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman-Ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Amen. As long as we're in this world, none of us is free of faults, mistakes, and sins. May we be forgiving, and may we be forgiven. May we be forgiven, and may we be forgiving. Bismillah. Astaghfirullah. 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 Everything in existence is the manifestation of a single source of life and being. And we say these words, La ilaha illallah, to remind us of the oneness of being, and to remind us not to make idols of our egos, whims, and desires. Bismillah, la ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha And God answers all calls made in sincerity and truth. Bismillah, Ya Allah. Allah. We give thanks for the light under which we gather, for our peer, Hazrati Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, for the generations of seekers and guides that have come before us, and for all those who have been our teachers.
Amen.
And we pray for the health and well-being of everyone in this circle, our families, our children, our children's children, future generations, and our world.
Amen.
And we mention at this time anyone in need of prayer or healing.
And especially hold in prayer and heart Shazra and her family who've lost 3 beloved family members this week.
And may Almighty God make our intention and our awareness sound and bring us in readiness to the center of true beginning. And may the light of this circle be received wherever it's needed. By the breath of Mevlana, by the secret of Shamsi Tabriz, by the nobility of Imam Ali, with the blessings of Muhammad Mustafa. Let us say Hu. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.